Hi everyone, welcome back to another week on the Brush by Brandy YouTube channel. And this week we are working on this piece that's behind me, only it's not just a piece. This is actually a part of a set. And I kind of sneak peeked this on my pages that this was actually a tiger oak piece. And I don't take this lightly. It was beautiful wood, but this came from a family that has owned this piece for decades and they want to keep it in their family. And so they want to give it an update that's a little bit lighter feeling, but has some texture. I was really inspired by the owner of these pieces. She does fabric art, and so this finish actually reminds me a little bit of fabric. It's got a lot of woven texture. It's very much in its ugly phase right now, but trust me, as we build up some layers, this is all gonna come together. This is a dresser, a mirror, and a bed frame that we're all gonna do in a matching finish. It comes out really pretty, you guys. I'm gonna add a little bit of sparkle, a lot of layering of colors, some neutrals in there, and I think this is really going to add a lot. We're also going to save a nod to that old wood finish. We're going to see some of those that wood grain peeking through. Hope you guys enjoy it, and I think the final result is really going to be beautiful. So stick around, let's get started. Here's where I started on this piece, and this is a photo of it in its original home where it's going to be going back to. You can see that beautiful grain on there. Try not to freak out on me yet. I promise you this one comes out gorgeous. This piece is in remarkably good condition. It's been very well cared for, very well loved, and I want it to continue to be that way. So I'm going to start out by moisturizing the insides of these drawers. Old wood gets really dry and thirsty. Think about it, spending years inside a home with the heater on and the fireplace on. It's going to dry out that old wood. So I try to pay attention to every area of a piece when I'm working on it, and that includes moisturizing the insides of this drawer. I'm using Whitewashed Furniture Tonic, and this is a liquid form of their furniture salve, and I can squirt it right into the drawer and massage it in with a brush. We're going to be doing a bleached wood top on this, and so I want this as light as possible, and so I've sanded already half of this so you can see where I'm going with it. Because I have so much to sand through, I went ahead and brought out my Surf Prep 5-inch orbital, and this is the Surf Prep model that I consider my muscle. I also have the 3x4 electric ray, which is super versatile and will strip a top, but because this is so much to go through, I really wanted a little bit more muscle to try to get through it faster. So what I'm going to do, I've got an 80 grit paper on here, and I'm going to take this down. The first layer I'm going to take it down to is just going to take off the top, the clear coat on this, and then I'm going to get down to the stained wood, and then I'm going to get down to where I've got some stain soaked into the grain, and I even want to get as much of that out as possible because we really want to keep this top light. So let's go ahead and start sanding on this. So I'm going to pause on this because I've done about one single pass and I've gotten rid of the clear coat on here, but now I'm down to the stained wood and I'm starting to go through it. So this is where I'm going to need to slow down my process a little bit and really start focusing on getting some of this stain out of the wood. This is soaked in a little bit deeper than just that clear coat was. That first pass would have been enough to just scuff it up so that I could put primer on it, but I really want to get into this wood, so I'm going to keep going on this with a few more passes. So now I've reached another level on my sanding, and that is I've got most of the stain off the surface of the wood, but I've got this deep stain in the grain of the wood, and I even want this out. So this is a really deep sanding that I'm doing, and thankfully this is a really thick veneer on a nice old piece, so I've got a lot of room in the wood that I can keep going. So I need to get it all the way down to this, even though this is just in the grain. If I was going to be restaining this top, I would say this is probably acceptable. I don't need to clean all that grain out, but we want a bleached wood look. Now that I've done just about as much as I can with my 5-inch random orbital, I've went ahead and unplugged this, and I'm going to get out my 3x4 electric ray. This is where the difference between the sanders comes in. Spots like this I would not try to get into with the 5-inch random orbital. I was able to get this edge, but I'm going to offset my paper just slightly, and I'm going to get this edge here, and I'm also going to scuff the body of this, and this is where the nimble ability of the 3x4 comes in. With the prep work on my top just about done, it's pretty much sanded down. I'm going to go ahead and take my sander while I have it out and start working on the body. The body of this does have a fairly thick clear coat on it. You might have noticed by how long it took me to sand that top. And so I do want to take down some of that glossiness so that my paint adheres really well. I did that by scuff sanding the surface of the dresser using my Surf Prep sander in a 220 grit paper. Next, I'm going to thoroughly clean the body of this piece using Green Ease Cleaner. I wipe over the top of it, and I noticed right away, as I kind of expected, this piece was a bleeder. Look at all that coming off of the wood. That's not dirt, you guys. That's the tannins. The oil from the wood are seeping through. So I know right away that I'm going to need to use a good primer on this piece. All primer has quickly become one of my favorites to use, and I love it because it's a gripping primer and a stain blocking primer in one. So it's really the only primer that you need to have in your arsenal. And I'm going to go ahead and apply it over the top of this. I'm just brushing it on. It goes on just like a paint, and I'm choosing light gray because since I have to prime this piece, I'm going to use this layer of primer as a layer in this layered finish. It's going to end up showing through in the end result. The light gray is going to be perfect. While my primer is drying on the bottom, let's go back up to the top and pay some more attention to that. So where I kind of left this piece was with the sanding all done, but I've still got that stain soaked deep into this wood grain, and this is some deep wood grain. This tiger oak is no joke. So I'm going to use the Green Ease stripper, and I'm working it in with a nylon brush, and you can see right away it's starting to pull some of that stain out of the grain. After I worked the stripper in with the nylon brush, I left it on for a few minutes, and then I came back with a slightly firmer brush, and I'm going to really brush it into that grain and start working out some of that deep soaked stain. I'm trying to get as much of it out as I can. This was a lot of work, you guys, but I really wanted to leave a nod to the history of this piece and show some of that wood grain. This process ended up working great. I got most of the deep soaked stain out, and now I'm going to do a bleaching treatment on the top. For my wood bleach, I'm using oxalic acid, which is a wood bleach, and I get this on Amazon. It's a powdered formula. It is chlorine based, so you want to make sure that you're wearing a mask with this. It can kind of make your eyes and nose want to water if you're breathing it in. Do this in an open, ventilated area, and you mix this with some water, dissolve that oxalic acid into the water, and then I'm just going to brush on a thin layer. And it often takes multiple coats of this to start getting the color to come out of that wood. While my coats of the oxalic acid are drying on the top, I'm going to go back down to the bottom. I do this really often. I'll keep the top going on its own steps in its process, and at the same time I can alternate and go down to the body and work on that. It works out really well in the process. All right, I told you this was going to be a layered finish, and it really is. There's a million brush strokes in this look. It comes out really beautiful. And I told you that the owner of this piece does fabric art herself. It ends up looking like a woven fabric, but it takes a lot of brush strokes to get there. So I started out with my gray primer on the bottom. That's going to be my base that peeks through. My next layer, I'm going to alternate from a light layer to a dark layer. So I'm going up and I'm going to use a Whitewashing paint in the colors called Carbon. And then my next layer is slightly lighter than the Carbon. So you'll notice I'm alternating each time from a light to a dark to a light to a dark. And I do that repeatedly so that each coat shows through the next. As I'm applying each one of these colors, I'm using natural bristle chip brushes. These are just really cheap and expensive brushes, and I use them because they leave behind a lot of texture and brush strokes. That's exactly what I want in this look. So I'm using a cross-hatching motion, which is a vertical and a horizontal brush stroke to create these layers of cross-hatching. You'll notice here that I alternated to yet another lighter color. So each layer is a variation of the colors, and again, alternating from that light to the dark. I will list all the colors that I use in the description for this video, so you can catch that full list there. So now I've got a really good base of brush strokes and texture built up, and I'm getting to some of my final layers. And so I'm going to start working in some whites, but I'm going to alternate different shades of white. And it's kind of fun to do this because you can see the difference in contrast between whites that have gray undertones. In this case, I used Whitewashing paint in Kashmir, has some gray undertones. Ivory has some yellowy undertones, and then you can use a color like Snow Owl or Bone, which is a more pure white, and you get really good contrast in between the shades of white. So I used a little bit of water when I'm doing this layer, and that's because I want to sort of thin out these brush strokes, almost to a color wash over the top of those grays to really soften them a little bit. I learned to listen in doing this set, and I'm going to tell you guys right now, I will probably never do another set like this. And that's because there's so much variation in this process and so many brush strokes that it can be really difficult to get a consistent look across multiple pieces. And I've done one set before that was 2 pieces in this finish, but trying to do a total of a headboard, a footboard, a dresser, a mirror frame, it got really challenging to keep them consistent. So I want to give that warning up front that if you're doing this finish, I really recommend doing it on singular pieces because trying to get it matching is really a challenge. So here you can see I'm starting to get to some of my final layers, and I did end up working in just a little bit of an oyster color metallic and sort of a champagne color metallic. And that's because I want these threads of this linen texture that I just built up to catch the light just right. It comes out really beautiful when the sunlight hits it, and it's just got those threads of metallic woven in there. I really, really recommend weaving in some metallics with your matte chalk paint. This is a great view too because you can already see all those layers of color, how they've built up together to create the final finish. So after bleaching my wood top, it still had a lot of orangey tones in it, and I really didn't want those. So I'm going to add a whitewash, but because I've exposed all this rich wood grain, I need to apply a clear primer over top to lock in those oils before I apply the white over top. That's going to keep my whitewash from turning yellow over time. So be sure you use that clear primer to lock in that wood grain. And now I'm using Wise-All paint, and this color is called Kashmir. I use this in my weave on the body, so it's going to tie in with the colors that are on the body as well. So I'm applying it over the top of that clear primer. I'm using some water to create a really thin layer, and I'm going to brush it on as evenly as possible. Once I have an even coat over the entire thing, I'm going to come back with a rag and wipe it away. And that's going to leave just that white paint sitting in the grain of this wood. It's going to be a thin enough layer that I can still see the pattern of that wood grain on there. And that's the nod that I wanted to. This gave me a lot more consistency to the color of the wood than just doing the bleach treatment on top. It still was just too warm and yellowy against the white body. So now I've got my top done, my body is complete, but I need to pay attention to the hardware on this piece. It had old wooden knobs, which I'm never a fan of. And so my customer went ahead and went shopping, and she found some pulls that she really liked. They're a little bit modern. They're a combination of metal and glass, but we want to create back plates for those knobs and actually some keyholes to replace the old keyholes. And I'm going to make those out of resin. So I'm using Redesign with Prima molds and amazing casting resin here. You mix equal parts of A and B, pour it into my silicone mold, let it dry for about 10 minutes, and then I can come back and pop those out. And I've got these perfect molds that are going to be my hardware backs. After I pop those resin molds out, I'm going to use my drill to drill out the center. That's going to be where the screws for my hardware goes into. I'm going to match these up with where the hardware holes are on the body of the piece. I do this before painting it, so those holes make sure to get painted too. I don't want to have that white resin exposed. Next, I take my drill out molds and I'm going to spray paint them using a little bit of matte black spray paint. But I want these hardware backs to match the bronze color of the hardware that they chose, so I'm going to apply a little bit of heavy metals gilding paint from Wise-Owl. I'm just using a stippling motion and brushing that on over the black spray paint using an artist brush. This bronze metallic was the perfect color to match up with the hardware that they chose. While the paint on my molds is all drying, I'm going to come back to the body of the piece, and it's time to add some wax detailing. So I'm doing this down here at some of these moldings, and what's funny about these is these pieces have gorgeous details to them. But I have to say that in the tiger oak, they got lost. It was just so busy. And now with the painted finish, you really notice how ornate they are. So I'm going to use a little bit of Redesign with Prima decor wax. This color is called Eternal. It's a beautiful antique gold, and I'm just going to brush it on around some of the edges. I even gave a pedicure to those feet. My hardware backs are nice and dry. I'm going to stick those on using a little bit of Titebond Quick and Thick adhesive. Find my placement on those that lines up perfect with the placement of the holes for my hardware. Then I'm going to come back with a little bit of black wax, and I want to kind of give a little bit of an antique look around the edges of these. So I'm going to apply a little bit of black wax and then smudge that out so they have a kind of a smudgy effect around the edges of the hardware. I did this also around the edges of the feet and the keyholes, all designed with that black wax. All right, I'm just about done with the body of this piece, but I told you that it had a matching mirror as well. So all the treatments that I'm doing to the body, I'm also doing on that matching mirror. I'm going to go ahead and decorate all the ornate details on that, also using a little bit of my black wax and my gilding wax. When I paint on mirrors, I always paint onto the glass of the mirror, and then I come back at the very end and I'm going to scrape away all my paint. That includes the primer and the clear coat. I scrape it away using a razor blade. This is one of the last steps that I do, and then I'll clean my mirror using a vinegar mixture. That gets my glass nice and clean. It gets my paint finish right up to the edges of the glass, and I find that it can take just as much time to prep the glass for paint as it does for me to just paint on it and scrape it at the end. Speaking of clear coat, I sprayed this in 2 coats of Whitewashed satin varnish, and I did 3 coats on the top to give that a little bit of extra protection. With my piece all clear coated, this one is done. It is staging day. I staged this with a base of simple vintage looking flowers, a little bit of color that'll pop in my photos. Speaking of photos, here's the final look at this piece. This one is done. I hope I did justice to this beautiful set. If you guys enjoyed this video, you can find links for everything I use in the description for this post. You can find more Brush by Brandy on Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, and YouTube. Don't forget to click that subscribe button and check out my website at brushbybrandy.com.